Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie and Dr. Religions throughout history have made claims about health and healing. Our guest today, Dr. Tom Ellis, has conducted research into the psychology of religion and health, focusing on religion's impact on immunology. I look forward to hearing what Dr. Ellis has to say about religion's impact on physical health. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You've been a guest previous, but it's been 2 or 3 years now. So
I think it's been a while. Yes,
I'm really happy.
Back.
Really happy to have you back, and you've been doing some interesting work in the interim that I want to talk about today.
I'd like to think so, at least.
I want to throw out some words just for our audience to give our audience a view of an idea of what kind of work you do. So,
Sure.
You're an expert on Hinduism.
Yes, I can claim that, I think.
Yeah, and an expert on the psychology of religion.
I also would like to think that.
Okay.
Do some of that work.
You write about terror management.
I do.
You do some theoretical work in religious studies.
I do, absolutely.
And most recently, immunology.
Most recently, immunology. I'm very excited about this project.
Great. So you're working on a book, I think,
I am.
entitled, at least tentatively, Religion and Immunology.
Or the immunology of religion.
Okay,
yes,
great.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that then. How did you get interested in this connection between religion and immunology?
Right. Well, so some of the work I had been doing was on ritual in religion, and particularly some of these rituals that involve maybe hurting the body or hurting other animals. One of the things, blood sacrifice, got me very fascinated.
Right.
And what I found was that there was a literature out there that suggested that some of these rituals were what an anthropologist, Richard Sosis, would call a costly and hard-to-fake signal of commitment. And so the idea is that over, in effect, evolutionary time, one of the things that the human animal had to do was to learn how to cooperate with genetic strangers. We're naturally disposed to want to cooperate and help our genetic relatives, kin altruism.
Right.
But the human animal needed to bond together in larger groups in order to survive, because we're slow and weak animals.
Right.
So we needed, cooperation was a way that we could sort of take advantage of our early environment.
Okay.
But many anthropologists noted that to look at some of these rituals as means of signaling economic cooperation, honest signals of economic cooperation, forestall the free rider problem, didn't actually capture that many early religious rituals had to do with healing. And so this got me into some of the shamanism research. Some will argue that this is our earliest form of religion and that shamans were there to facilitate group cooperation and healing. And so I recognized that there was a lot of work done on the group cooperation side of things, but maybe not so much on the healing side. So I really started getting interested in how does religion, actually facilitate either the maintenance of health or the healing of the sick. And
So just to be clear, a lot of ritual studies focus on group maintenance.
Absolutely.
Something we look at in sociology of religion.
Yes.
But you have taken a little different track here, and you've looked at how some rituals might actually allow for healing or maintenance of the immune system.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So let's go there and
Love to.
talk about some examples, right? So give me an example of how religion might affect either positively or negatively the immune system.
Okay, right. So I'm working on, within this larger project on immunology of religion, I'm working on what I call stress management theory. And so the idea is that we know that being chronically stressed is not good for your immune system. People who are dealing with chronic stressors have a depression in the immune response, and so you're much more prone to health risks if you're chronically stressed. So one aspect of my immunology project addresses how religion deals with chronic stress, and one means of being chronically stressed out is to feel like you have no control over your situation. And so I make an argument that religion lends a sense of control over an environment where you might actually not have real control, but if you believe there's a God out there or goddess that you can commune with, you can contact, and you can appeal to these divine agents to help you in a stressful situation, this will give you a sense that you have more control over it than you may not. And this is healthy for you to actually believe, even if religion might not be true, and I'm going to leave the theologians and philosophers deal with it. But if you believe that you have this kind of contact with a divine agent, it lends lends you a sense that there's control over the environment, and this can be good as far as reducing stress. But my real interest and what gets me...
Well, before you go to
Yes,
your real
please.
interest, right, so just a ritual, for example, like prayer, which is
Yes.
meditative.
Yes.
That is actually going to affect, at maybe a pre-conscious level, long-term stress and lower those stress levels.
Absolutely.
So that the immune system is not suppressed. So that's one way that...
That's one way of doing it, right? So that's dealing with chronic stress.
Right.
But a medical researcher at Stanford University, Firdaus Dabar, has done some fantastic work on the acute stress response.
All right, and this is where you're headed, right?
This is where I'm
All right,
headed.
let's hear about the
Okay,
acute stress.
so the idea, it looks, is that if you are witness to an acute stressor, you will have an immuno-enhancing response. So I came across this fantastic study where they did a salivary assay, which means they tested the contents of the saliva to see if there were any antibodies in there, like secretory immunoglobulin A, right?
Okay.
Fancy language, right? Big words. But what they did is they did a salivary assay prior to making the subjects watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, okay? And so I don't know if you've seen this movie, but it's full of gory, bloody,
Right.
macabre scenes, right?
No.
And what they did is after they had the subjects watch the movie, they then did another salivary assay. And wouldn't you know it, antibodies were flooding the mucosal membrane. And so this was one set of studies among many that have shown that if you show someone a bloody scene, their immune systems kick into gear. And this is an evolutionary adaptation because the idea is that when you see flowing blood, this is possibly pathogenic. And so your immune system gets ready for a possible infection. So what I decided to make a connection to was that, well, it turns out that some of the anthropologists working on blood sacrifice were sort of flummoxed. They didn't understand how cutting off a chicken's head could be healthy for anyone. In fact, one very famous French anthropologist, Maurice Bloch, even asked, and I think rhetorically, he says, how could killing cattle cure people? Well, I decided to take up the challenge. And so what I've sort of discovered and have sort of can substantiate maybe more circumstantially than not at the moment,
right,
is that it would look like blood sacrifices, which were often done in earlier communities when someone in the local group got sick, that this would have acted as an acute stress induction, and that would have helped the immune system. And this is what we see in the empirical data today, that if you are sick and you're submitted to an acute stressor, it has an immuno-enhancing effect for the sick. Now, what gets even crazier is that some people have asked, indeed in this larger literature, why would the local group ever come around the sick person? You know, when I'm sick, you don't want to come around me,
right,
and vice versa, right? Because this would be a moment where I could contract your disease.
Right.
But and so this was a point of consternation. How is it that when someone gets sick, the local group gathers around, the shaman does his ritual, and why would they do this? Well, it just so happens that being exposed to the acute stress induction not only helps the immune system of the sick, but it helps the immune system of those who are witnessing it. Mm-hmm. And so this would, in effect, help them not contract the disease in the first place. So they're around the individual, they see the acute stress induction. What is even more surprising is that upon re-exposure to the antigen months later, both the person who was sick and those who were witness to the ritual look like they have a more robust immune response upon re-exposure.
That's fascinating.
So this becomes almost an indigenous vaccination moment.
Oh, wow, that's so the short-term stressor then,
yes,
which is brought about by certain rituals like blood sacrifice,
absolutely,
actually has this positive effect on the immune system. That's so right. We've got two things going on now. Certain practices like prayer and meditation affect long-term stress.
That's right.
And then certain stressors can affect the short-term stress and actually boost immunity.
That's exactly right. So when we talk about stress, when I talk about my stress management theory of religion, that's the idea. And I'm not the first to talk about how religion can mitigate chronic stress, but no one yet has really gone into, well, what about the acute stress response? So when we talk about managing stress, indeed, you want to manage the long-term chronic stressor or what's the purpose of life? Why am I here? And all these kinds of ideas, woe is me. Well, we'll tell a story about meaning and purpose, and thank you, Pastor Warren, a purpose-driven life. This can reduce chronic stress. But then you have these very occasional rituals where you engage in the macabre and the bloody and the gory and the stressful. And that now I'm willing to make the argument that this has immuno-enhancing effects. And so way back when in the Upper Paleolithic, when shamanism was the only game in town and people were fighting off infectious disease, I mean, that's one of the things we have to recognize, that of all the selection pressures against the human animal over the Pleistocene past, infectious disease may have been the #1 pressure and could still be so today. So something as persistent and ubiquitous like religion in both the historic and ethnographic record calls out for at least a consideration. Was there a correlation between this robust selection pressure and this widespread cultural practice that is religion?
Well, let me ask you this. I have never witnessed a human sacrifice, nor an animal sacrifice.
Yeah, nor have I.
I know that there are religions around the world that still practice blood sacrifice.
Right.
But for the most part, in the contemporary West, we don't have that kind of sort of grotesque display.
That's right.
So does that mean that there are no rituals now, or that the rituals are not as functional, the type that would induce the sort of short-term stress an immunological response, or are they hidden somehow in some safer types of rituals?
I like the question. I mean, clearly now that we have advanced medical practices and that we really have ways of addressing infection with real allopathic medicine, I don't see, at least in the post-industrial world, the need for these kinds of stressful rituals for healing practices.
Right.
I mean, we still have stressful rituals in all kinds of places, like hazing rituals, in fraternities. This is one of those costly and hard-to-fake signals of commitment. You really want to be in this fraternity? We're going to have to haze you.
So does that function the same way?
It functions the same way as far as a costly and hard-to-fake signal of commitment is.
Okay.
Know.
Yeah, right.
But whether or not we still see the healing rituals in religion, this is fascinating, right? Because I mean, clearly there are people who will pray for other people, and this can be helpful. If you know people are concerned about you, they're laying their hands on you. That, in another fancy term, psychoneuroimmunology, to know people are caring about you, that is also good for your health response. Right. But what I do find fascinating, though, and I know we were talking about it a little bit earlier, when you look at this rather interesting phenomena today of anti-vaccinations, the anti-vaxxers. The studies tend to show that the cohort that's most aligned with anti-vaccination are religious. And this has made me think, well, what's happening here? And I have seen some data that suggests that as the health industry gets even more efficacious and you have a social safety net welfare system and all this, religion seems to be in decline. And so we can flirt with this idea that and this gets you into memetics and memes, but if religion is losing its prominence in the post-industrial Western world, it's fascinating that religious groups would be the ones that would be against vaccinations. So you would almost see an inverse correlation between the need for religion and the presence of vaccinations. And so the more we vaccinate, the least we may need religion to deal with the infectious disease problem.
Because we're getting our healing
from
science and from medicine.
Absolutely, right? And so if religion can act like an agent, and I'm not convinced it can, but this is where the memetics is, right? This is where Richard Dawkins will talk about means taking over the gene machine for their own replication. I'm not convinced of this yet, but something is funny going on with the anti-vaxxing movement and modern medicine.
So maybe you're suggesting this, I'm not sure. So anti-vaccination groups, that is almost ritualistic, or the taking a stand against a vaccine for religious purpose is a type of ritual.
Yeah, it could be.
A kind of dangerous ritual.
Indeed.
That might serve in part at least the same function as exposure to disease, exposure to blood.
And so what I'm thinking, and again, if I were standing up, I may be shooting from the hip, but what I'm thinking at present is that the presence of disease has always necessitated the religious response. And so if religion, once again, is in decline, and the data suggests indeed, so Western Europe is the go-to, Scandinavia is the go-to, that has this huge social safety net, welfare net, and indeed universal health care, then it's one of these moments where do people perpetuate the need for religion by not vaccinating their children? Is this a way of keeping religion prominent in life by, in effect, allowing infectious disease to still be a force in one's life?
That's very interesting. That's kind of a self-maintenance. Wow. So let's talk about the future a little bit. I mean, where do you think this is headed? And we've talked about the decline of religion. We've talked about new adaptive strategies within religion to maintain religion's purpose and relevance.
Yes.
In the face of science and so forth, particularly on the healing front, because this does seem to be one function of religion, healing,
absolutely,
that could be dispensable, right? So
it could be.
Is this bad news for religion, or will religion's been incredibly adaptive through the years?
It has been. It has been. I don't foresee religion really going away anytime soon. And I think it may lose some of its healing functions, especially when it comes to acute stress induction. I'm still willing to argue that knowing people are praying for you, I don't see that going away, and that's going to be that's good. I'm for that. But the one thing we have to understand about when it comes to science and religion and conflict, and I do see some conflict there, science is never going to tell you a story about immortality unless we start really messing around with obsolescence genes and start pulling those things out, right? Yeah. And I know Yuval Noah Harari has recently talked about these ideas about being able to live in perpetuity. Whether now that's a good thing or not is something for another episode, I'm sure.
Right.
But I think religion's capacity to give people a real sense of meaning and purpose in their lives is something that science has a lot of catching up to do.
So you just suggested something else, which is in some ways is an extension of disease and healing, that is death, right?
Yes.
So until or unless we figure out a way to download our consciousness into a robot, or
which may not even be a replication of us.
Right. So then we're still stuck with death, one way or the other. So
still stuck with death.
And religion has rituals also in a similar fashion. Is that why we expose ourselves to dead bodies to help come to the reality of
I think a lot of maybe religious virtuosi and charismatics will do this. They'll have the skull on the desk and whatnot. And this goes for many religions. I do think that some of our religious traditions encourage us to consider death. And I think in a way, if you go, say, with some of the Buddhist traditions, they're going to tell you that you only really become a fully enlightened being when you come to real terms with impermanence. And that, and I challenge some of my students in my classes in world religions, the belief in the afterlife. Does this immediately entail a devaluation of this life? And some have made that argument. I'm not convinced of it, but the argument's out there that that this life really becomes so sweet when you don't think there's another one to come. Right. And that's so some people would say, well, if there's no life after death, then life's purposeless. Well, some would say it's the exact opposite. That life really becomes so purposeful, almost suffocatingly so, when this is it. And this is the only it you're going to have. So I think religion helps people deal with these kinds of issues. And this would be one of those things about chronic stress, and this is part of that terror management material I've worked with greatly, is that it looks like the human animal really needs to be able to tell itself a story about meaning and purpose, because the alternative, at least coming out of terror management theory, is that to live consistently with the skull in front of you, could lead to a certain behavioral paralysis. It can lead to, and this is, if we really want to go down this road, we can argue that chronic stress not only leads to psychopathologies like massive depression, but also subfecundity. And anything that contributes to subfecundity is in the biological sciences a natural selection pressure.
Subfecundity. Explain
Subfecundity. Men who are really stressed cannot have sexual intercourse, and women who conceive and are chronically stressed cannot carry to term. So subfecundity would be the inability to reproduce at a viable level. And so that clearly is a selection pressure.
So from an evolutionary perspective, religion functions well, right?
Terribly well.
Yeah,
terribly well.
To support biological reproduction.
That's exactly right. That's
That's a fascinating insight as well.
Some people will say, the Marxists will say that religion is an opiate and it makes you sort of lazy and not want to challenge the system. I kind of make an argument that religion may be an aphrodisiac indirectly. It keeps you getting back into bed.
All right, that's very interesting. It's very interesting.
I think so. Thank you.
Yeah. So from sex back to death.
Some would say they're right related.
So we as human beings we can imagine our own death, right? So
that's tough to say.
Okay. So but we have it hanging over our heads. So
we have either the great or terrible capacity to anticipate the future.
Right.
And that was a selective advantage to be able to track time. Yeah. But we have that extra little ingredient, because Baby Bear may look like he's mourning Mama Bear's death, but Baby Bear probably does not say to himself, but the grace of God go I.
Right.
We have that capacity. Mm-hmm. And so we have this great gift of consciousness and self-awareness, and no one would ever just poo-poo that, but it comes with a great burden.
Yeah, and that leads to that terror and that angst that you were talking about. So is that the kind of fundamental driver to our existential angst, our ability to imagine that we're going to die someday?
I think there's something to be said about that. Now, our ability to imagine being dead looks like it's cognitively close to us. We can't actually imagine not imagining, which actually brings you to what I call in my own research multidimensional death anxiety. Yeah. So you can be anxious about death and say, well, when my lights go out, I'll be gone for eternity. That's sort of what is called an intrapersonal death anxiety.
Right.
Most death studies show that people are most anxious about death on an interpersonal level, which means that most people, when they think about being dead and they're anxious about it, they're not sure if they're going to go to heaven where they'll hang out with their friends and God.
Right.
They're actually afraid that they will be socially isolated for eternity. And the kind of go-to thought experiment would be, it's one of those moments where you imagine that you could wake up in your coffin 6 feet under, totally alive, totally aware, screaming for someone to come get you, and no one hears you, and that will be your state in perpetuity. Yeah. So yes, indeed, I think one can argue that a lot of what drives our behaviors, culture in general, may be the attempt to build up a story about one's significance and one's purpose and one's long-term endurance and what could be accurately described in other terms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find all this fascinating. You've given us kind of, I guess, would you call your research here psychology of religion or the biology of religion, or
right?
You're bringing in so many different aspects to the study.
I am, and I like to think that my work is truly interdisciplinary like this.
Right.
That the immunology, well, to trot out the fancy word again, there is a research agenda on psychoneuroimmunology, where the notion again is it's a tracking of how do psychological states affect the immune system, and quite possibly vice versa. So yeah, I'm at a confluence of psychology, biology, some anthropology,
right.
And clearly, of course, religious studies.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating.
Thank you.
And I look forward to your upcoming book. So we're going to have it out, in 6 months or a couple of years?
We'll see. Yeah. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, so and maybe when it comes out, we'll have you as a follow-up guest, and we'll explore some of these issues a little more deeply. But
I'd love that. That'd be great.
It's been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us on Religion and Life here at App TV. Again, I thank Dr. Tom Ellis for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. Join us next week when my guest will be Dr. Wendell McKenzie, a geneticist who will talk about the genetic links to religious and moral behavior. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.